There are two major anatomical divisions to the respiratory system, the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. The upper respiratory system consists of everything above the neck, and the lower respiratory system consists of everything at and below the level of the neck. So here we will examine the upper respiratory structures first. We'll begin with the nose and the nasal cavity of the upper respiratory system. The nose is the only external respiratory structure. All other respiratory structures are going to be internal. And the term nose implies two structures, the external nose and the nasal cavity. So the nose, that is both the external nose and the nasal cavity, function to produce mucus, to trap dirt and debris, to filter, to warm, and to moisten the incoming air, and the nose also acts as a resonance chamber for speech sounds. The majority of the anterior nose is made up or composed of hyaline cartilage, which is shown in light blue in this diagram here. While the superior aspect of the nose, that is the bridge of the nose that connects it to the rest of the skull, is composed of the paired nasal bones. The nasal cavity is divided into right and left halves by the nasal septum. The primary tissue that lines the nasal cavity is a ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Recall that this tissue produces mucus, and its job is to trap dirt and debris and things like that in the nasal cavity. The hard palate and the soft palate make up the inferior border of the nasal cavity. The hard palate consists of bone, while the soft palate is a muscular structure that functions to close the nasal cavity when swallowing. The nostril is a structure that forms the anteriormost opening to the nasal cavity. This is the structure that the inhaled air enters the nose through. The posterior nasal aperture is the posteriormost border of the nasal cavity, and this aperture leads to a region called the nasopharynx. The nasal vestibule is a small chamber that's located just inside of the nostril, and the nasal vestibule is lined with vibrissae, that is small coarse hairs that function to filter large particles and dust from the inhaled air. In the middle of the nasal cavity are the nasal conchae, which are folds of bone that are covered with a nasal mucosa epithelial tissue. The nasal conchae project from the walls of the nasal cavity and kind of hang downward towards the palates. The nasal conchae have a couple of functions. The first is that they enhance turbulence of the air that is entering the nasal cavity, and this turbulence helps to ensure that the air becomes well mixed inside of the nasal cavity. And this mixing allows the nasal conchae to warm and moisten the incoming air. And the conchae also increase the mucosal surface area, which gives more room for the nasal sensory structures to occupy. The paranasal sinuses are air-filled chambers that are located in some of the cranial and facial bones of the skull. These chambers are located in the frontal, the ethmoid, the sphenoid, and the maxilla bones. They also function to warm and moisten the incoming air, just like the nasal conchae do, and they also behave as resonance chambers for speech sounds. And one additional function of the paranasal sinuses, because they're not solid, they're hollow, they function to make the skull lighter in weight. The paranasal sinuses, as well as the nasolacrimal ducts, which are the ducts that drain the tears from the eyes, have openings inside of the nasal cavity, which allows both the paranasal sinuses and the nasolacrimal ducts to drain into the nasal cavity. The pharynx is a muscular, funnel-shaped tube or structure that spans from the base of the skull to the sixth cervical vertebra. Both skeletal muscle and epithelial tissue are the primary components of the pharynx. And the pharynx is divided into three anatomical regions depending on the location of that particular part of the pharynx. We have the superiormost nasal pharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is just posterior to the nasal cavity, and it functions as only an air passageway. It also contains the opening to the pharyngotympanic tube, which we'll examine in a moment here. And the nasopharynx is also lined with a type of epithelial tissue that is similar to the epithelial tissue of the nasal cavity, which is a pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. The oropharynx is just posterior to the oral cavity, and it's situated between the nasopharynx and the laryngopharynx. It functions as a passageway for both air and food because it connects both the respiratory and the digestive systems together. We see that it is lined with a stratified squamous epithelium, so in that regard it is very similar to the epithelium that we find in the mouth. The inferiormost part of the pharynx is called the laryngopharynx. Immediately inferior to the laryngopharynx is the esophagus, so it makes sense that the laryngopharynx functions as a passageway for both air and for food. So just like the oropharynx, it is also lined with a stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So one important structure that we noted earlier was the opening to the pharyngotympanic tube, which is found in the nasopharynx. The pharyngotympanic tube, which goes by a couple of other names, principally it goes by the eustachian tube or the auditory tube. This tube functions to drain the middle ear and allows the pressure in the middle ear to equalize with that of the atmospheric pressure. And so it turns out that the pharyngotympanic tube, or the eustachian tube, is more horizontal and shorter in children, and this causes drainage from the nose to more easily reach the middle ear and cause infections. So this would give us an answer to the question of why do children get more middle ear infections than adults do. So in adults we see that the tube is longer and more vertically oriented, making it more difficult for nasal drainage to reach the middle ear. Also found within the nasopharynx and the oropharynx are the tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsil is located in the nasopharynx, and the palatine tonsils are located on the left and right sides of the uvula, near the soft palate, so kind of at the border between the oral cavity and the oropharynx. And the lingual tonsil is located at the posterior base of the tongue. So the tonsils collectively are clusters of lymphatic tissues that function to trap pathogens like bacteria and destroy them before they enter the rest of the body. Because of the location of the palatine tonsils at the posterior part of the oropharynx, these are the tonsils that will most likely become infected, as they will more often encounter bacteria entering the mouth through the body. Entering the body through the mouth than the other sets of tonsils will. And last but not least, we have the uvula, which is a small lobe of flesh that hangs from the posterior roof of the mouth. It is connected to the soft palate, and it's composed of skeletal muscle, just like the soft palate is. And it also shares the same function as the soft palate. So that is, the soft palate and the uvula are muscular structures that close the nasopharynx when we are swallowing to prevent food from going up and into the nasopharynx. And instead, that helps to direct food down into the esophagus.